Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today we're going to answer another pretty common question that we've been asked, especially on our preservation videos where we talk about preserving ships like this long term. Just how long term do we think that we could preserve a museum ship for? This is a great question, and it's completely subjective. And I'll tell you why that is in a minute here, but know that everything I say here is purely my own opinion and not necessarily anything that we've got vast stores of data to back up. So, first off, we are in one of the officer staterooms on the O2 level. This is probably a guest officer stateroom that would have been reserved for flag staff. If we had a flag officer, an admiral on board, and he brought some of his staff, they would probably end up in a space like this. This particular stateroom is off of the tour route. It's not used by our encampment program or as an office space anymore. And so it has deteriorated pretty severely. The main issue here is the deck on the flag bridge, the O3 level above us. The teak deck there rotted out. Water got under it and then rotted the steel. That steel is much, much thinner, mild steel. It's probably 3/8, maybe 1/2 inch, compared to, say, the main deck that is mostly 1.5 inch special treatment steel. That'll hold up much longer. This stuff up here in the superstructure rotted out, water got in, and because the steel deck is not even, there is a level of concrete leveling compound and then tiles glued down on top of that. These were added in, these particular tiles are from the 1980s, but that tile, that leveling compound, then held any water that got into it against the steel deck. The steel rusted, which caused the leveling compound to bubble up when the rust pushed it up, and that popped tiles loose. And it's causing the steel underneath to corrode, it's causing the steel around the edge of the room to corrode, and it's damaging the original furnishings of this space, which in many cases could date all the way back to World War II when the ship was built. They definitely date to when the ship was in service in the 1990s. And it has the added problem of when that rots out, it's going to flood into the space below it. Now, in our project to restore the deck, the first area we started with was the O3. That was in some of the worst shape, and it was causing the deterioration to spread. So that has since been fixed. The deck above us was completely doubler plated over, and you can still see weld marks in the overhead from that being done. So we no longer have a water intrusion problem in this space, but we haven't repaired this space yet either, because we don't really have a use for it. It's redundant to a number of other officer staterooms that we either use or have on display. So, how long can you preserve a museum ship for? It depends on a number of factors, but in terms of steel-hauled vessels, preserving ships like this is a brand new thing. Steel-hauled vessels themselves are only about 150 years old. You start to see the first steel ships in the US Navy come out in the 1880s and 1890s. So they haven't been around all that long. And the modern practice of preserving museum ships is essentially a post-World War II practice. So the oldest museum ships that are steel-hauled and currently on display date back to around World War II. So at this point, I should say that there are wooden-hauled vessels that have been preserved for much longer. Ships like HMS Victory or USS Constitution date back to the 1700s. There are ancient sources that say that ships from thousands of years BC were preserved by the ancient Greeks up into the Hellenistic period, which would potentially be the longest that a museum ship, a proto-museum ship, was displayed to the public. Other ships, such as Egyptian funerary or Viking funerary vessels that were buried as part of a grave complex, have theoretically been preserved for thousands of years, but not for display. Some of these vessels are currently on display. They're all wooden hulled. Other current museum ships, like Vasa, were sunk in anaerobic environments where there's very little air that has prevented corrosion, and have since been raised and put on display. And even that is a fairly new concept. So I'm going to try and limit this discussion to specifically steel-hulled vessels like New Jersey. Wooden ships tend to be smaller and cheaper to maintain, although I did work on Constellation before I came here, an 1850s era wooden vessel, and I did work on her in dry dock, and I can tell you it is not cheap or easy to maintain a vessel like that. But we're going to limit it to steel vessels for this one. The earliest steel-hulled vessel I'm aware of being preserved was the Battleship Organ from the Spanish-American War. She was forced out of commission by the Washington Naval Treaty and had to be demilitarized, but rather than being scrapped or expended in tests like other pre-dreadnought type battleships, the people of Oregon took her as a museum ship, and she operated from the mid-1920s all the way up until 1941 or 1942. So she had a 20-year run as a museum ship, which would have been the earliest I can think of. And then they gave her back to the Navy as part of the scrap metal drive of World War II, and she was partially scrapped, and then her hulk broke away, and she was no longer salvageable as a historic artifact, and she was eventually totally scrapped post-war when there wasn't a steel shortage. So even though that ship was saved temporarily, the idea of long-term preservation of the vessel wasn't quite there yet. The first modern museum ship that's still in operation is the Battleship Texas. She's a World War I era dreadnought-type battleship that was used up to the end of World War II, and she was decommissioned. And when she was going to be disposed of, the people of the state of Texas asked to take her as a museum ship, and she started operating as a museum ship open to the public in 1948. So Texas is not the oldest museum ship. She's not even the oldest steel-hulled museum ship, but she was the earliest one to be turned into a museum ship. So you could say that she is the longest continuously operating museum ship, except that she isn't currently operating. She's been closed for about a year for some critical maintenance work, and in theory that work will be successfully completed in a year or two, and she will reopen, and this whole caveat goes away. She's the oldest continuously operating. But in theory, something could happen, and I don't even want to think about that, but that's why I'm adding the caveat. I'm going to cite Texas pretty extensively in this video because she is the oldest museum ship, but also because you guys ask a lot of questions about her, and she's a ship that's near and dear to my heart. I've visited her a couple of times, and I hope to continue to visit her well into the future. But for more information about what my colleagues down there are doing with that vessel and the unique, innovative, and state-of-the-art preservation techniques they're going to use to restore that vessel, we put a link down below to their Facebook page where they give pretty regular updates on the work they're doing. Another common question about Texas while we're on this subject is that she is going to be preserved on dry land. And this exists because when the Texas Parks Division was operating the ship, they did a study to turn her current berth into something of a graving dock. So build a cofferdam across the back of it and drain it so they could do maintenance work in place and potentially leave her that way long term. She is no longer operated by the Park Service or the state of Texas. There is a private nonprofit foundation that is running her now, and they are looking at a number of alternatives for preserving and displaying the vessel into the future that may include preserving her in place, but may also include moving her. So I do not know yet what the long-term preservation plans are for that vessel. That's why you should check out their page and stay up to date. You'll be as informed about her as I am. The World War II era ships tended to be built to last for about 20 years. And with major work, that could be extended for another 5, 10, maybe even an additional 20 years. The war-built ships in particular were not designed to last. They were designed to go out, and they weren't even necessarily designed to come back afterwards. There was going to be a certain number of them lost during the war, and we were building so many, we didn't necessarily need them long term. That's why the pre-war ships were nicknamed the gold platers, because they had way more frill and stuff built into them than the wartime ships. As it turned out, in peacetime, the Navy wasn't getting nearly the same budget, so they ended up keeping in service a lot of their World War II era ships for their full lifetime. And then when they were disposed of, some were turned into museum ships. And the bulk of the museum ships currently operating in this country, and therefore in the entire world, because by far most museum ships exist here in the United States, are World War II era ships. There are, of course, exceptions, but the vast majority of museum ships are World War II era or served through to World War II. The ships had, I wouldn't call it programmed obsolescence, but they were only designed to last for about 20 years because up till that point, the pace of change had been so rapid that within 20 years, your pre-dreadnought battleships, your first generation dreadnought battleships were obsolete and were replaced in favor of modern type battleships, which were then within 20 years replaced by fast battleships and aircraft carriers. So the pace of change was very quick, but it led to these ships becoming exorbitantly expensive. And so by the mid 20th century, rather than replace these huge capital ships every 20 years, they had enough reserve of buoyancy at that point and enough sunk expense that it became easier to modernize them. And nowadays, I would say that we build ships, more so the large ships than the small littoral combat ships, but we build ships to last for about 50 years. If we can get 50 years out of a supercarrier, that'll be worth the $2 to $4 billion investment. And that does involve a massive midlife overhaul and several other major yard periods for these vessels. So, World War II ships designed to last for 20 years. Many of them saw service for 30, 40, 50 years in the case of some of the Essex-class carriers and Iowa-class battleships in particular. Some of them didn't quite see that much service. For example, the other World War II battleships, Alabama, Massachusetts, North Carolina, only saw service during those 5 wartime years and immediate post-war years, and then were decommissioned and held in reserve for a period of time and eventually turned into museum ships. No ship is designed to last forever. You can, in theory, continue to cut out rotting material and replace it with new steel, and that can potentially keep a ship going. But it becomes more expensive and more of that material rots over time. So to get back to the initial question, my loose rule of thumb is that when a ship hits 100 years old, That's about 40 years of service, 60 years of sitting in mothball or operating as a museum ship. It starts to incur massive cost penalties. Ships that have hit the 100-year mark are ships that you hear about pretty often. The Battleship Texas, the cruiser Olympia. These are some of the most critically endangered museum ships in this country for sure, and arguably in the world. And they deserve your support because they are the last of their kind. In Texas's case, she's the last dreadnought left in the world. In Olympia's case, she's the last new Navy type pre-dreadnought era cruiser left in this country, and one of only a few preserved in the world. It's absolutely worth saving these ships. I would put both of those ships within my top 5 museum ships to save, period. But they have crossed the 100-year mark. They have huge maintenance needs at this point. There is a common myth out there that the museum ships that are critically endangered are because they have been criminally neglected. I can tell you, I work very closely with the people who are preserving Olympia, and pretty closely with the people who are preserving Texas, and they are some of the absolute best in the business, and they aren't doing anything criminal in the preservation of those ships. They are facing huge challenges, and they have not enough money to do it. And part of the issue is Battleship New Jersey gets a lot of operating support because we still have sailors from this ship around. Battleship Texas decommissioned at the end of World War II. There are very few World War II era people left, certainly not any that are able to support her, go out and volunteer, donate huge sums of money. There's no support there. Olympia, Spanish-American War era, World War I era, none of those guys are left to support her. So she is something of an oddity to enthusiasts like myself, but there is nothing tying her to the greater outside community. And that limits the number of donations she gets and makes their jobs exponentially more difficult than my job here on a ship that is still very much in the public conscious. And you can see that I'm not doing the greatest job with this ship. We cannot preserve the entire vessel to the same condition she was when she was in service. Even with all the money that the state gives us, all the money that you guys have donated to the channel in the past year, and hopefully will continue to donate, we are doing our best, but it's very much triage. And at a certain point, I believe around the 100-year mark, that deferred maintenance reaches the point where it's near catastrophic. Near catastrophic. They're still coming back at that point. Both Texas and Olympia have a better chance of survival than of failure right now. Even though Olympia is from the 1890s, and Texas is from the 19-teens. As you start to reach 150 or 200 years, if you're still deferring maintenance, that's probably it. That's the ball game. Sink the ship as an artificial reef so that divers can at least experience her for another 50 years, or put her on dry land so that she can have another 50 years before she pancakes. Strip off as many pieces as you can to turn into some sort of museum or display, which a number of ships that were not able to be saved as museums have received. But if your vessel, like say the Battleship Texas, which is known to be in critical condition and is receiving massive support both from the state and hopefully from donors like you, you can come back from that, and there is a good chance that at the end of a year or two worth of preservation in dry dock with $50 or $100 million of work, that that vessel can continue to be displayed in the water for another 50 or 100 years until we get to another level of deferred maintenance like we are at now. So, in summation, thank you for bearing with me. This has been a much longer rambling video than we set out to film. But in summation, to wrap it all up in a few words, the 100-year mark is important for these ships. That's when deferred maintenance starts to snowball out of effect, and it's when you're almost certainly guaranteed to not have any of your original crew supporting you anymore. You've started to leave the public consciousness by the 100-year mark. 150 years is probably death if you haven't fixed the 100-year stuff before that. But we just don't know. We've only been preserving steel-hauled vessels for the last 80 years or so. We don't know what comes beyond this. None of these vessels, none of the large ones at least, have had issues, catastrophic issues with fire or flooding. But in the next 50 years, we may well see climate change affect these ships. The Battleship Alabama was picked up out of her mooring and tilted by a hurricane. We could very well see 100-year storms like that damaging large museum ships. We could well see a catastrophic flooding or fire event on any of these ships at any time. Just because it's never happened to any of the large ones doesn't mean it couldn't. And that, of course, is going to affect long-term preservation. In the end, it all comes down to money. If these ships remain culturally relevant, even after they've lost their veterans and are able to continue to raise money, they could well outlast us all. If that is not the case, and we've already started to see on smaller scale museum ships that do not have funding. For example, Clamagore is competing with Yorktown and Laffey for the funding in Patriots Point. And because she is one of over a dozen World War II era submarines being preserved in this country, she's not a priority for funding, and she will soon no longer be with us. Ling, again, another submarine, does not have massive backing, and she is endangered. She's one of the few museum ships that has faced an external threat in the form of flooding, and by all rights, she should not come back from a catastrophic failure like that, but there are still people fighting for that vessel. If you continue to support museum ships like the Battleship New Jersey, and your kids continue to support us and your grandkids, then there is a good chance that this ship will be around for 200 years. After that, we'll all have to find out together. It's never been done before. Thank you guys for watching. Again, this video was way longer than we set out to film, but it turns out I have some thoughts on this subject. You have any more questions about this subject, drop them in the comment section down below. It may well lead to more videos like this one. If you would like to find a way to support your local museum ship, or find out if you have a museum ship local to you, and by support I mean either monetarily or by volunteering on board. We are literally kept afloat by the team of volunteers who work on Battleship New Jersey. We're going to put in the description a link to the Historic Naval Ships Association, which is a group that represents international warships that are preserved, and a link to the museum ships website, which has links to, I won't say all of the museum ships preserved worldwide, but all of the museum ships preserved worldwide that we know about. Battleship New Jersey does receive operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, but we also receive support from viewers like you. So if you would like to support us and our YouTube channel, there's also a link for that in the description below. Your support allows us to make multiple videos a week. Remember to like, share, and subscribe so that you're notified when those come out. Thanks for watching, and thanks for supporting museum ships.